All right. Well, thank you all so much for being here. I'm Tommy Berry. I'm director of Cato's Robert A. Levy Center for Constitutional Studies and editor-in-chief of the Cato Supreme Court Review. And we're here to talk about Randy Barnett's new autobiography, A Life for Liberty, The Making of an American Originalist. And we're thrilled to have Professor Barnett here to talk about it, as well as Jonathan Turley. I was trying to write sort of a summary of what the book's about, but then I realized that since it's about Randy's life, there's kind of some overlap between Randy's bio and what the book is about. So I'll just introduce both of our speakers. We're going to have Jonathan give some initial remarks, his response to the book, what he learned from it, what he took away from it. Randy will respond to that, and then we'll just go through there, roughly chronologically through the book. So to my far left, Randy Barnett is the Patrick Hotong Professor of Constitutional Law at the Georgetown University Law Center, and is the faculty director of the Georgetown Center for the Constitution. After graduating from Northwestern University and Harvard Law School, he tried many felony cases as a prosecutor in the Cook County State's Attorney's Office in Chicago. A recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship in Constitutional Studies and the Bradley Prize, Professor Barnett has been a visiting professor at Penn, Northwestern, and Harvard Law School. Professor Barnett's publications include 12 books, more than 100 articles and reviews, as well as numerous op-eds. Before this one, his most recent book was The Original Meaning of the 14th Amendment, Its Letter and Spirit, with Evan Bernick. In 2004, he argued the medical marijuana case of Gonzalez versus Raich before the U.S. Supreme Court. In 2012, he was one of the lawyers representing the National Federation of Independent Business in its constitutional challenge to the Affordable Care Act. He's appeared in numerous documentaries, including PBS's Constitution USA with Peter Segal and A More or Less Perfect Union with Judge Douglas Ginsburg. And he portrayed a prosecutor in the 2010 science fiction feature film Inalienable the Movie. And he blogs on the Volokh Conspiracy. And I can say, having read the book, every single one of those you'll get a story about if you read this. And Professor Jonathan Turley is a nationally recognized legal scholar who has written extensively in areas ranging from constitutional law to legal theory to tort law. After a stint at Tulane Law School, he joined the GW Law faculty in 1990. He's the founder and executive director of the Project for Older Prisoners. He's written more than 36 academic articles in a variety of leading law journals, and he recently completed a 3-part study of the historical and constitutional evolution of the military system. He served as counsel in many notable cases, including representing 4 former U.S. Attorney Generals during the Clinton impeachment. Professor Turley has served as counsel in a variety of national security and terrorism cases, ranked as one of the top 10 lawyers handling military cases. He served as a consultant on homeland security and constitutional issues, a frequent witness before the House and Senate on constitutional and statutory issues, as well as tort reform. He's a nationally recognized commentator, a member of the USA Today Board of Contributors, and has worked at CBS and NBC as a legal analyst during national controversies. And Jonathan, we'll start with you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. The opportunity to talk with and about Randy's work is a great honor. I mean, in many ways, this book is not an academic exercise. Most of us, when Randy agreed that he would write this book, which he says in the book was after he had his first grandchild and decided that he would sort of leave this for them. He also left it for the rest of us. In fact, most of us quickly bought the book because we wanted to see if there was some indication of the secret sauce that makes a Randy Barnett. We hoped that we could produce a whole line of them hydroponically in the basement of Cato Institute. But I think you're going to get much more than that. And I say that with no sense of bitterness because Randy and I are both from the Chicago area, but we have an insurmountable divide in that he is a White Sox fan and I am a Chicago Cubs fan. And it just shows that libertarian values can transcend virtually any challenge. Actually, Randy, as he talks in the book, comes from a city that before Randy arrived was known primarily as the location of Jake and Elwood from the Blues Brothers as to where they came from, and that's Calumet City, or Cal City as he refers to in the book. And what's interesting about the book, and there's every chapter is fascinating, about the making of not just an originalist, as the book suggests, but of a contrarian, someone who is willing to stand apart. And it is fascinating to see how he says in the book that if it wasn't for Cal City, he wouldn't be the person he is today. And he explains the sort of makings of a contrarian, and in his case, being one of the few Jewish people in Cal City, facing at times anti-Semitism, even in his school, made him who he is today. And it reminds us that we are all sort of the product of where we were. Where we're going is pretty much a product of where we were. And for Randy in this book, he captures how a Randy Barnett comes about. And it's interesting to see that his father was a contrarian, including being a Chrysler fan when he was surrounded by Ford fans, and also not moving to sort of the Jewish areas, the well-known Jewish areas around Chicago, like Skokie, and going to Cal City. But what follows that is an intriguing development of who he is today. But I have to say that you'll have to forgive me, but there was one part of the book that I have to read. And that is, on March 1st, 1962, I thought I had read everything that Randy Barnett had written, because I usually read his stuff within seconds of its becoming available. But I had missed this. So in March 1st, 1962, at age 10, Randy Barnett published his first work, which was in the Hoover Highlights. And this is the entirety of the work, and I'd like to read it. It'll only take a couple hours. Quote, "Be patriotic. Washington believed in a democracy. He was thankful for liberty. We don't appreciate liberty like he did. To us, it just comes natural. We should be more patriotic for what our forefathers fought for and won." And then he put in caps, liberty. That's the full extent of the publication. But when I read that, after chuckling, I thought how incredibly profound this was, that this fourth grader wrote about liberty. Because as many of you know, much of Randy's scholarship reminds us that things like the Declaration of Independence really didn't talk about democracy, it talked about liberty. And liberty was the focus of the framers. And even at that young age, somehow this young Randy Barnett was already focused on liberty and what it meant to him, what it meant to his neighbors. And he would, of course, become this towering figure of libertarianism, of constitutionalism, to help us better understand the Ninth Amendment, to understand the function, the foundations of originalism. But he also, in the book, talks about how one of his mentors told him that all the great intellectuals, to some degree, stand apart. That what gives them their unique insight, which is what you see in all of Randy's writings, is the ability to look at ourselves critically, to stand apart. And to that extent, his mentor said, to be a true intellectual, you can't be within any group entirely. You have to be able to see from the outside in. Randy's been able to do that, which is what has brought the clarity of his writings, but also the fact that Randy could see a horizon that many people couldn't see, including, of course, his famous arguments in Salzburg Reich and also his writings about the Commerce Clause. He was describing something that many people didn't fully see, but he also was describing a way to get there. And I don't want to take up too much because we have to hear from the man himself, who probably knows a lot more about Randy Barnett than any of us, and that would be Randy Barnett. But I often tell my students, I remind my students what George Bernard Shaw said. It's my favorite quote of Shaw, when he said that unreasonable people expect the world to conform to them. And he said, that's why all history is made by unreasonable people. I don't think that Randy Barnett ever expected the world to conform to him. I expect when you read this book, he's as surprised by his own influence and success, probably more than anyone else. And that humility gives this all the greater authenticity. But Randy Barnett is a wonderfully unreasonable person. He is a model that I've often cited for my students. I tell my students all the time, you should live your life boldly. It's not like a Monopoly game. You don't go around as many times as you want. You go around once. You should live your life like Randy, like it's captured in this book. He stood apart, and it didn't bother him to stand alone, whether it was in Cal City when he was young, or whether it was as a constitutional scholar. He was willing to stand apart. And I can think of no greater model for my students or for anyone than the life of Randy Barnett. And so this book, I suggest you read, not just to find out who Randy Barnett is, but who we're all capable of being. And so I recommend it entirely. But when I stop there, so we can hear from the man himself.
That was great. Thank you so much, Jonathan. Randy?
Well, thank you so much for having me. Thanks for putting this program together. Thank you, Jonathan, for agreeing to do this. Really generous of you. Also, thank you for heeding my request to go first, because I wasn't sure how I was going to get up and just start talking about myself. Because I actually haven't done a program quite like this. I've done a lot of podcasts, but that's always being interviewed. So they're asking me questions as well. I have to get up and give a talk about, well, here's the thesis of my autobiography, me. So I really appreciate you going first. Well, I think it's important that I start with the following, and that is, I was raised in a middle-class family. And this book really is about the passage of time. So I was actually, it might have been lower middle class. I remember when I applied for financial aid at Northwestern, and my dad had to fill out the forms. I don't think I knew what my parents made, but I think he had just approached $10,000 a year at the time we were applying for financial aid. And I did get financial aid from Northwestern, which equalized the cost between going there and going to the University of Illinois, which is what I had expected to go to. Growing up in Calumet City, which was a very colorful place. It's a place where Al Capone had a home at one time. It had a very sordid history. At one time, it was nicknamed Sin City. The source of this was the fact that after Prohibition ended, Indiana stayed dry for a while. And that meant Calumet City, which was on the border of Illinois and Indiana, was the place where all the mill workers and the refinery workers would come and drink. And all the accompanying activities associated with drink, which were, strip clubs and all the rest, all were taking place in Calumet City. So it was a kind of a bawdy place. Life magazine did a cover story on it. Now, most of that was pretty much gone by the time I was growing up. There were still some remnants of State Street, which is what it was called. But I lived on the good part of town, which is known as the Gold Coast, which was a Levittown type development of tract homes. Ours was like 750 square feet. And it was a singular place, and it was a very insulated place. And culturally, we were much more part of Northwest Indiana, which is known as the region, than even of Chicago. Although my parents were from Chicago, and my grandparents lived in Chicago, and my dad had a store in Chicago, so I did spend time there. But it was so insulated, and I was sort of so out of it that when I got my SAT scores, and I went to my counselor had a meeting to give me some advice on the basis of my SAT scores. He said, well, with your SAT scores, you could get into Northwestern. And I said, really? Where's that? And I thought it must be in the state of Washington or Oregon or something, northwest of, but no, it was in Evanston, Illinois, the north side of Chicago. So my best friend and I, Jay Blackburn, and I drove up to Evanston to take a look at it, and it was beautiful. It had 2 beaches, and it was on the waterfront, and I'm a little superficial that way. I thought that, well, this is going to be a great place to go to school. So I applied to 2 places, University of Illinois and Northwestern. Those are the only 2 places I applied to college. And fortunately, I got into Northwestern because it was a result of going there that I was exposed to philosophy. Before I get there, one of the other things that you mentioned in your gracious remarks was the role that my father played as the original contrarian in the Barnett family. Yes, we were a Chrysler family. There was always a divide in those days between GM families, which are the most numerous, and then Ford families. And if you were really out of it, you were a Chrysler family. Because if you were really, really out of it, you'd be a AMC Rambler fan. But
We were a Rambler family in Chicago.
really,
Yeah.
well, that good for you, because those cars were really hard to keep running. But Chrysler. So, and then when it came to hamburgers, like everybody, the popular one was McDonald's, and the secondary one was Burger King. But of course, my dad had to be a fan of Prince Castle, which none of you have ever heard of. It doesn't exist anymore. It was this Midwest hamburger chain that was somehow objectively best. But the thing that set my dad out, and what was so impressive to me as a kid, is that he always had a reason for his opinion. He was a contrarian. It was his natural instinct to go the opposite way. If the crowd was going this way, he would go that way. But he always had a reason for going that way. And I always knew there was a reason behind every one of his opinions, including all of his political opinions. And he was a conservative Republican, which is where I got my politics from. When I was 12, 2 years after I wrote my first article on liberty, mistakenly calling us a democracy instead of a republic. I'll never live that down. 2 years later, I got up in front of my junior high school student body and argued and debated on behalf of Barry Goldwater. And it was in front of several hundred students. And in the course of writing this book, I have been a pack rat, and I've carried boxes and boxes of papers and mementos from basement to basement with no particular reason. I don't know what I was ever going to do with them. But I actually, when you write a book, it's nice to have saved everything. I have my debate notes, including my literal summation for my debate for Barry Goldwater. But the point here is that my dad, the contrarian, always had a reason, and in a way, this is kind of what has animated my approach to the law. It is including my approach to constitutional law, and that is the government, if they're going to do something, they need to have a reason, and it needs to be a good one, and my dad always had one. So he was my first mentor, but then the book is also a story of the other mentors that came afterwards. My next mentor was my grade school band director, and we had an extremely dynamic band in Calumet City, very uncharacteristic of the town, partly because he was a Jewish import from Chicago who took over the direction of the band and was very ambitious. And we did all kinds of things. We toured the Midwest, we played the Milwaukee Spectacle of Music, we played the New York World's Fair in 1964, played in Madison Square Gardens. I've actually played the Garden, and in the Kiwanis International Convention. But he was a very hardcore, bleeding heart liberal Jew, and he loved arguing politics, as many of them do. You may know. So here I was. He started me playing the clarinet when I was in second grade, so he was sort of a force in my life from the second grade through the eighth grade, and he would always argue politics with me. So at home, there's my dad with the conservative, Republican conservative principles, and then there's Mike Landis, who's arguing the other side, and that was a very nice seminar growing up until I graduated in the eighth grade. And then when I got to high school, I had a mentor. My speech and debate coach was a mentor, and then finally, when I got to college, is kind of where I left off, is when I discovered philosophy, which really did change my life. It turns out that there is an underlying animating principle that sort of explains everything that I've done. And this is actually somewhat conscious on my part, and that is my interest in justice. And I don't know where the interest in justice per se came from, but I know when it was first sparked in terms of a career, and that is when a television show came on CBS television called The Defenders. And it starred E.G. Marshall as the father and Robert Reed as the son, a father-son criminal defense team in New York, filmed on location. It was very gritty, it was very realistic. And unlike Perry Mason, which was a show that had been on every Sunday, which was about solving murders, when the lawyer would solve a murder, The Defenders was a television show about practicing law and representing people, both innocent and guilty alike, and all the ethical dilemmas and the moral questions that were raised in the practice of law. And when I saw that television show, that's when I decided I wanted to be a lawyer, and a criminal lawyer in particular, and I never veered from that course. I was never tempted to become a big law lawyer or a tall office building lawyer, as Justice Scalia used to call them. To me, being a lawyer meant being a trial lawyer first, and secondarily, it meant being a criminal trial lawyer. And then I became a prosecutor in Chicago. But when I got to college, it's when I discovered philosophy. because I hadn't realized growing up, even through high school, that there was actually a discipline in which people wrote about justice and what it was and argued about it. And it wasn't just something that was in your head, it was something people wrote about. And luckily for me, Northwestern was on the quarter system, which I never kind of realized until looking back why it was so valuable, because I started off college as a political science major because I was very interested in politics. Thought maybe one day I'd have a political career. I was on Abner Mikva's high school advisory council. Abner Mikva, who ended his career as a DC Circuit Court judge, was a representative from Chicago for many years. And so very, very liberal guy, and I was the one conservative in amongst his high schoolers, so I was always arguing with him. So I had sort of had politics in my mind as a possible career. I took political science at Northwestern when I was a freshman and discovered that political science is not actually about political theory most places. It's about empirical studies of voter behavior and who knows what it was, but it was extremely boring. And then for some reason, I don't even know how it came about, I saw there was an intro to philosophy class. I didn't know what philosophy was, but maybe the course description was about interest to me. Maybe it was the time of day it met, not too early, not too late. But it was a fantastic intro to philosophy course, and that's what I realized, there's a whole discipline. And then there was time to course adjust in my first year because we were on the quarter system. That was the winter quarter, and by the spring quarter, I took ethics from a man named Henry Veach, who was my next mentor, who is a natural law philosopher, a liberal Democrat in his politics, but a very esteemed, preeminent natural law philosopher, though the field of philosophy had moved away from natural law, so he was sort of on the outs with the main thrust of analytic philosophy, but I took to this like a duck to water, and then he became extremely, he paid a lot of attention to me. He treated me like I was a grad student as a freshman and sophomore in college, and I toyed with the idea that maybe instead of being a lawyer, I'd be a philosophy professor and then work on this justice stuff. But then some bad political stuff happened to Henry in the department, and I won't go into what the details are. I discuss what they are in the book. But he had to leave. He felt compelled to leave Northwestern in my junior year, came to Georgetown, finished out his tenure as a professor, as the chair of the philosophy department. But when that happened to Henry, I thought, academia is just too dirty a business. I'm going to continue my course of being a criminal lawyer in Chicago, where the corruption is sort of more upfront and you can deal with it than in academia. And so by the time I got to law school, I was certainly single-mindedly focused on being a criminal lawyer. But one of the other things that I did when I wrote this book is I kind of fact-checked my recollections, and it's amazing how many of them aren't quite right. So for example, I would long tell the story that when I got to law school, it hadn't occurred to me until maybe halfway through law school that maybe I'd want to be a law professor. And then in the course of researching the book, I found all my applications to law school, and I found that in my applications to Harvard Law School, I said, I think I might want to be a law professor one day, teaching jurisprudence, which is the philosophy of law. So I actually had that objective early, but what I didn't have, and what cost me, and I describe this in the book, is I didn't have any idea of what it takes to become a law professor. So for example, I didn't know the kind of grades you had to have, and I didn't know anything about law review or clerkships or anything like that. And I'm not sure it would have necessarily changed what I did, but I didn't do anything right when it came to being a law professor. Partly it's my contrarianness. Partly I think it's a character flaw that I talk about in the book, and that is that I have a hard time making myself do something I don't want to do. And I couldn't imagine why anybody would want to be on law review. It just seemed like a bunch of scut work. And in terms of grades,
and yet you're a White Sox fan.
And yet I was.
Okay, all right.
I have to say, I actually,
appreciate
I don't know if you think better of me or worse of me, but I just don't care for baseball all that much.
Oh, that's much better.
Okay, so I'm not really a White Sox fan. I don't follow them. I am a Bears fan, which is tragic. It's a very tough thing to be.
Indeed.
Especially this year. But at any rate, I didn't know how to be a law professor, so I didn't know what it took. I didn't realize what a hole I was digging myself in terms of being able to finally get a teaching job. But instead of doing all the things you're supposed to do, I became a Cook County State's Attorney, a prosecutor, an assistant state's attorney in the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, which is not a high-status job. It happens to be a phenomenal job, and which has been quite formative to me. And I'm very, very glad I did it. But eventually, again, I did find my calling as a law professor, which is why when people online or everything say, you should be on the Supreme Court, or you should be Attorney General, and you should be whatever it is they say, which is they mean as the highest form of a compliment, and I take it as a compliment. It's hard for me to explain to them that I have the job I want. Mm-hmm. This is the job for me. This is the job I was made to be as a law professor, and Georgetown is the place for me as well. Being in D.C. has worked out very, very well for me. So I don't know if there's anything else that you want me to talk about.
I've got plenty of questions to prime the pump, but that was a fantastic overview. So thank you, Jonathan. Do you have any reactions to that?
No, it's the thing I love about your path as you describe it. Is the fact that it was to some degree unplanned, and that is the sign of a contrarian. Most of what contrarians do is unplanned by design, but it makes you sort of wonder when you read this book whether great minds like Randy's are the result of coming from a place and a time where they have stood apart, because it requires you to break away from sort of fixed ideas to be able to see a new path, which Randy saw very clearly on things like the Ninth Amendment, on the Commerce Clause, on issues of that kind. And it's sort of an inner eye that unless you have to use it, you might not have it, that it sort of atrophies over time. And what really comes out of this book is someone who was standing apart from those earliest days. And it's also, I love the book because I'm a Chicagoan. I'm a North Sider as opposed to a South Sider. But a lot of this does sort of resonate with how we are the products of the people that made us. And I particularly thought that Randy's discussion of his father was very, very moving, in that you realize as you get older even if you don't realize it at the time, what an impact your parents have. And certainly fathers with sons have a special bond that cannot be reproduced. But I love the fact that you say in the book that your dad always wanted to be a lawyer, and he sort of followed the family business and they were doing a sort of a laundry service.
They had a retail laundry.
But what comes out of the book is that he really was someone who had a keen legal mind. And there is one part of the book where he was buying complete ownership in his later business, and it had been reviewed by an attorney and even reviewed by Randy, and they had signed off and said, this looks good. And his father said, I think you're missing the interplay of these three provisions. Mm-hmm. And it just shows that you probably were the product of a legal mind in your father. But I love those vignettes in the book.
Yeah. The result of the interplay of the three clauses, which independently all seem fine, is that my dad could pay in full for the business, and then the person who was ostensibly selling his half of the business, which was his brother, would actually end up owning the whole business. It was a swindle, is what it was. His lawyer missed it, I missed it, but my dad, the laundryman, he actually got it. One of the sort of morals of the story, since you've emphasized this, is that you should thank your mentors while you still can. And that's especially true of the younger people out there. I was able to thank most of mine, but not all of them. And so the people that help make you who you are, you should just tell them. It's a good thing to tell them.
I want to remind our online audience that we'll be taking questions later in the event, and you can start submitting your questions now directly on the event webpage, or on Facebook, on YouTube, or on X using the hashtag CatoSCOTUS, CatoSCOTUS. Sort of following along on this discussion of your parents and the mentors and how they molded you, you talk about shifting or changing your self-identity, at least, from conservative to libertarian in college. I feel like that's maybe a part of growing up that a lot of people can identify with, is you're typically molded by your parents. They're the first, whatever your dad believes has to be exactly right. And then you go out into the world and you encounter other ideas. Can you talk about that shift? Was it really a shift, or just a different label for what you always were? And if you talk about a particular friend introduced you to libertarianism, if that friend hadn't, do you think you would have found it eventually, or was that a key point in your life?
It was very key points. It felt like a big shift at the time, although it probably was kind of a continuity from what I always was. Because I was a conservative, a self-identified William Buckley type conservative. But there are two general kinds of conservatives. There are tradition-based conservatives, and then there are liberty-based conservatives. And I was clearly, as you can tell from the piece I wrote when I was 10, I was a liberty-based conservative. And so there's not that big a jump from being a conservative of that kind to being a libertarian. In fact, when my good friend Jeanette DeWise, who was my classmate, first started telling, and was active in Young Americans for Freedom, first started telling me about libertarianism when we were students together, I told her I didn't want to, don't bother me with this. And my reason for not wanting to hear about it was I thought the word libertarian sounded weird to me. And that was it. That was the only reason. I just didn't want to hear any more about it. But she did bring this junior professor in named John Cody to speak to our philosophy and religion residential college, which we lived in our junior and senior year. So this was in my junior year. John came and he spoke. And he talked about what libertarianism was. And I went to the event. And my reaction to what I was hearing is, oh, this is a rational conservatism. Because one of the things that conservatism then lacked, and to some extent it actually still lacks, and that is a theory. It's really more a collection of notions and attitudes, and you could call them principles, I think, but it doesn't cohere as a theory, and that is the way my mind works. I strive towards sort of theoretical coherence, which is what my articles are always about. They're about putting things together and trying to create, to recognize a structure, that these different disparate parts, how they fit within a larger structure. That's kind of what I do. And so that's what I thought I was hearing. I thought I was hearing a rational conservatism. But I disagreed with some of it, and I started meeting over about a 6-month period of time with this junior professor at the student union when I would make all my objections to what he was saying, and then he would give me his reasons. Again, this is based on reasons, and he had an answer for every question. Eventually I started thinking, well, maybe I'm wrong, maybe he's right, and then I kind of went all in to the point where my senior year at Northwestern, I taught an accredited seminar which students were allowed to teach, a student-organized seminar on libertarianism, and we read Rothbard, and we read Friedman, we read the Tannehills, we read the Perkinses. These, for those of you in the internet audience, we may recognize those radical documents, and Heinlein's The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. We read those for the course that I taught. And the person who was the intellectual the person who told me that many times intellectuals are not quite of the culture they were in, that was something Murray Rothbard taught, because Murray is somebody who I got very close to beginning in my first year of law school when I went to Harvard Law School.
Yeah, and that's also a fascinating story. I was struck when you were at Harvard that it seems like, I mean, I'm sure there was more to it than you were able to put in. It seems like you get there and immediately you're becoming friends with Murray Rothbard, you're hanging out in his living room, you're grilling him on libertarian theory and tough questions. How does that come about, and was that a product of there just being so few libertarians at Harvard, was it just that there were so few that you could all fit in his living room, or what did you have to do to achieve that?
I guess there's another moral in the story, and that is I wrote him a big fan letter when I was on my way to law school, saying how I taught this seminar using his writings and what a big impact he'd had on me. And I asked a whole bunch of questions that nobody could reasonably expect anybody to answer. I hate getting letters like that now. But I like the fan letter part, but it's all the questions part I could do without. So I wrote him this big, long letter, and he eventually did respond, but he didn't respond right away. What he did is he gave a copy of it to somebody who was also starting Harvard Law School and the Joint Harvard Law Business Program named John Hagel III. And John got this copy of the letter from Murray, and John was the new president of the Center for Libertarian Studies, even though he was an incoming law student. And CLS, the Center for Libertarian Studies, was a New York-based organization. Our offices were on Union Square in Manhattan. And so John was the president, and all of these, it was the board made up of all these libertarian intellectuals like Murray Rothbard, Ralph Raico, Bill Evers, Ron Hammaway, Ralph Raico. It was just sort of a who's who of libertarian intellectuals all formed the board of this group. And John having been given this letter, within the first few weeks of me getting to law school, called me up and told me that he was a friend of Murray's, and we went out and had coffee at Harvard Square, and we became friends. In fact, we ended up forming our own organization. The reason we formed our own organization is because we kind of wanted to make connections with all the libertarian groups in Massachusetts, but we didn't want to just go and attend the meetings and be members. We kind of wanted to come in at a different level. So we created our own independent organization called the Center for the Study of Social Systems, CSSS, and we decided we would do a white paper on what the needs of the Massachusetts libertarian movement were. And in that capacity, we made appointments to interview all the heads of all the libertarian organizations in Massachusetts and collected their feedback about what they needed. And the conclusion of our white paper was that they needed a place for libertarians to gather, and then we organized a dinner group at the Hong Kong restaurant, which was then a restaurant in Harvard Square. And our first speaker was Robert Nozick, and Murray came, and Leonard came, and we had our final speaker of the year was Nicholas von Hoffman of the Washington Post. And so this became a big source of interactive activity. But getting back to how I met Murray, that fall, the very fall of my first semester of law school, John took me down to New York, and we went to hear a talk that Leonard Liggio was giving at Fordham, and Murray was in the audience. It wasn't that well attended. And afterwards, we just went to Murray's living room, and it was Murray, John, and me, and we just fired off hypothetical questions our torts professors had been tormenting us with, saying, how would you respond to this, and how would you respond to that? And what was so memorable about that evening was that Murray couldn't answer any of those questions any better than we could. And he went, what? And we give him all these different hypotheticals, and this was eye-opening, because I had faulted myself as a first-year law student for not being a good enough libertarian to know how these torts cases should be decided. And then I go to Mr. Libertarian, the one who knows everything about libertarianism, one would think, and he can't do a better job than I can. And this planted a seed that ultimately became a part of my book, The Structure of Liberty, and that is that libertarian principles, political principles generally exist in the abstract, and when it comes to applying them into particular cases and controversies, they don't necessarily determine particular answers in all but the most simple of cases. And for other cases, you need conventional rules of law, and that is partly the relationship between justice and the rule of law, which is the subtitle of my book. Justice are the abstract principles of rights that should guide the rule of law, and to which the rule of law serves. But then the rule of law is an independent system in which positive law is developed to come up with specific rules and doctrines that could actually govern human conduct, something that living by abstract principles really can't do.
Yeah. It's sort of, you get the impression reading the book that perhaps you were so active in these libertarian activities that it almost took priority over your studies a bit. Would that be fair?
Yeah, it would be fair. I was not a very good student. I did not get very good grades. I didn't know that I didn't really know I didn't think about what grades you might need to be a law professor. I knew I had good enough grades to be a Cook County State's attorney, or whatever criminal law I wanted to do. It isn't that I didn't try, but I actually didn't know how to be a good law student. I didn't realize what law school exams, what it took to write a good exam until I had to grade them.
Yeah. Well.
And then I realized, well, I have to grade this somehow, and I have to evaluate it, and the students have to tell me all this stuff, and the information has to be there. If I had had the slightest clue about what went into grading an exam, I would then know how to take them, but I didn't, so I wasn't a very good student. And you're right, I was busy doing those other things.
But I mean, obviously it led to a ton of intellectual growth that paid off in your academic career. So for current law students or college students watching now, what advice would you give on how to balance that, on those extracurriculars, those connections, versus the academic, the going for the grades? What do you prioritize?
Well, every year at Georgetown, I am, thanks to the law school, invited to give an orientation talk, which I call Law School for Conservatives and Libertarians, in which I give them specific advice. And I begin the session by reading to them the letter I wrote home after my first day of law school to my parents and grandparents, which is reproduced in the book, in which I complain about how I feel like they're trying to indoctrinate me, and I'm afraid I'm going to lose myself, and my goal here is to resist being indoctrinated. And I tell the students, and I do the orientation, that is the perfectly wrong approach to being a student. If you have deep principles, and they really are your principles, then you're not going to lose them by being confronted with competing ideas. What you really need to do is try to learn what the professors have to offer you. Ideally, if you could just plug into their mind and somehow import all their knowledge into your mind, then that would be great. But of course, you can't do that. So to get the most out of your course, you need to understand what the professor is actually saying and what they think and how they think. And you're not going to get that by trying to figure out where they're wrong. Mm-hmm. Even if you're right and you're smart enough to figure out where they're wrong, now what you got? You got one thing that they're wrong about, or they're wrong about this. That's not going to help you on the exam. It isn't going to help you understand the material. What you need to do is understand how the material looks from their perspective. So what I advise students is to suspend your disbelief. Get yourself, as much as you possibly can, into the mindset of your professors with whom you disagree. And the fact that you disagree is another benefit, actually, because you really do want to see what the world looks like from the point of view of those you disagree with. And then you will learn more, and then you will do better. And so just don't be like me. That was not a good thing. It means I did not get as much of a legal education as Harvard had to offer. I made out anyway, but I left some learning on the table.
Mm. Jonathan, what advice would you add to libertarian or conservative law students?
You know, probably the most contemporary advice that I give to conservatives and libertarians, and this the question I ask the most, is, you know, they're afraid about speaking openly in class. They're afraid that with very few conservative or libertarian faculty that remain, that they're going to be penalized. And I get that question a great deal. And it's funny because I had this debate with just recently at Harvard Law School with Professor Randall Kennedy, and Randall is a terrific person, and he's a very nurturing academic from what I could see. But he and I sharply disagreed because at one point, when the issue of self-censorship came up, Randall said, well, those are just conservative snowflakes, and that they're just conservatives and Republicans don't have the faith of their convictions. And, you know, I pointed out that, you know, there are very few conservatives on Harvard faculty, less than 6%, in a country that is divided right down the middle. And Randall said, you know, this is an elite university. We don't have to look like the country. And I pointed out, you don't even look like Massachusetts. I mean, Massachusetts is like 30% conservatives, at least Republicans. But for my students, they're afraid that if they speak openly, and I tell them, look, it's just life is too short. You don't want to go through law school and never speak your mind and never explore it. I had a student who came to me, she took my Supreme Court and the Constitution class, and she came to me when she graduated, and she said, you know, I feel like I have to tell someone. It was the day she was graduating. She said, you know, your class was the first class that I had in law school where I felt like I could actually be open about my values. Mm. And she said, I realize now how wrong that is. And it is wrong, and I felt really bad. But I always tell my students, don't do that, right? Don't give up. These 3 years go by in a blink. Particularly after your first year, you'll find yourself graduating. Don't do that. Don't give it up. My student's a first year, one of my sons is a first year law student, and I told him the same thing. He's at Harvard, and there's very few conservative faculty. And I told him the same thing, that you've got to be bold. And I think that's what I would advise.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's a matter of personal taste. What kind of person you are differs from person to person, how combative you are, how sensitive you are. I changed my approach to law school between my first year and my second year, to how I handle class. I was very outspoken and opinionated, with a political slant when I was a first-year student. And it cost me actually significantly in the long run. Well, in the long run, everything worked out fine. It cost me in the medium run. And that is I tried to get, this is the only time I failed to get a mentor that I was trying to develop, and that is my criminal law professor at Harvard, who not only was a criminal law professor, because I was interested in criminal law, but he'd been a former prosecutor, and I wanted to be a criminal lawyer, and he was a natural law person who wrote books about natural law. I mean, I couldn't imagine a better fit than this. And so I tried to, develop him as a mentor, And he was very standoffish. Of course, all my professors were standoffish, but he was very standoffish. But I was very outspoken, and my politics were known. And I changed that by my second and third year, and I'll just say what I changed it to was, instead of telegraphing my views, I started to try to figure out how I could ask critical questions from the student body that didn't telegraph my views, but that would, for example, highlight seeming tensions between the material and what the professor said, or what the professor said today versus what they said before. And then I didn't put my own views on the line, but I looked like I was very critical, and I got a lot more positive feedback from my classmates, for example, when I did that. But the reason why my first year approach cost me is that I did my independent study under him, and I wrote a paper called On Restitution, A New Paradigm of Criminal Justice, which he gave a B+ to. And I thought, I'm used to getting B+, it's probably a B+ paper, but nevertheless, I submitted it to a bunch of journals, and it got accepted by Ethics, one of the top 2 philosophy journals, faculty peer-reviewed journals in the world. And it got published more or less the way I wrote it. So he thought it was a B+ paper, but anybody can make a mistake. It was kind of out there. I can understand why he would think that. But then when I went into the teaching market, I needed a reference. And so I asked him. He was natural. I mean, I had him for professor. I did the independent study. We had all these same interests, and my paper's published in Ethics, and he refused.
Wow.
He said, I'll be a personal reference for you, but not a professional reference.
Wow.
And I have no idea what that means. Didn't know it then, still don't know it. But it cost me, because you have to have a good reference. Ultimately, Alan Dershowitz agreed to be my reference, because the reason he gave for that was that I used to argue with him in class all the time, and he loves that. So he became a reference. But frankly, Alan, the hero that he may be, and he is, he didn't have a big reputation as a scholar. That was not his thing. Whereas Weinreb, I've said his name, but he's passed on. Lloyd Weinreb did have a reputation as a scholar, and so he was he'd be a better reference to be a teacher. But as a result of that, I paid a price. And the reason I know, the confirmation I got that this was politically motivated is that a few years later, I was invited to be a visiting professor at Harvard Law School. So here's a kid who, got a B+ or whatever, was not a great student, and now I'm teaching contracts at Harvard Law School. And so Lloyd Weinreb invites me out to lunch, and we have lunch together, and he takes me to the faculty cafeteria, not a glorious lunch. Charles Freed, my torts professor, took me to the faculty club. That was much nicer. But anyway, I went out to lunch, and the first words out of his mouth were, "So who does a libertarian vote for this year?" Telling you, that was me. In his mind, I was a capital L libertarian. That was it. He would not be a reference for me. And had I been a little more circumspect, I think things would have worked out differently.
Wow. So both of you having experience as professors now, how have things changed for law students who are libertarians? And would you rather have been a libertarian in law school when you went, or today?
Well, I think it's better today, because there is a Federalist Society for Law and Public Policy. There was no Federalist Society there. I was in a section of 140 students. The sections are smaller now. Merrick Garland was one of my classmates in my section. But I felt completely alone. Now, there were probably other students who agreed with me, but we couldn't find each other. And the biggest contribution the Federalist Society makes to that problem is that if you show up for a Federalist Society meeting, you see who the other members are who are from your section, and from then on in, you have solidarity with them, and you don't feel so alone. I think the existence of the Federalist Society, not to mention the fact that the conservative legal movement, the theories promoted by the conservative legal movement have developed a lot in the last 30 years, and I've played a role in that, which is part of what the book is about. There's a lot more to learn, a lot of the work's been done for you already. And so but on the other hand, it's challenging. There's now real theories for you to have to learn if you really want to be a literate libertarian or conservative lawyer.
Jonathan, any?
Well, that's what I like about the book when I was reading it. It in many ways, Randy and I are sort of inverse images on so many levels, because he was a South Sider raised in a White Sox family. I was a North Sider raised in a Cubs family. He went to Northwestern. I went to University of Chicago. He started out as criminal prosecutor. I started out doing criminal defense work. The only thing we had really in common is a streak of contrarianism. that we were both contrarians. And I came from the more liberal Democratic side, but where I disagree, I suppose, is I think it was better when I was in college. When I went to University of Chicago, I loved every minute of it. It was like walking into the Star Wars bar scene. It was just everyone I thought was crazy. I mean, I stayed in the Dorchester Cooperative, and downstairs we had Trotskyites that would meet, and upstairs we had militant vegans, and next door we had libertarians, and we had socialists on the building next to us. I thought they were all crazy, but I was fascinated by the fact that they were seeing things that I was seeing and seeing something completely different. And I felt like I had a total freedom to explore those, to test them, to try them on. I don't think we have the same length of spectrum today in higher education, certainly not on the faculty. I think it's less tolerant. I think that Randy's absolutely right about FedSoc and other supportive organizations that make it easier to sort of plug into. But I think that there's this overwhelming orthodoxy in higher education that makes it difficult for students to do it. And that's on us. That's on educators today.
There's one way in which it was much better to be a libertarian back then, and that is libertarianism itself was a very dynamic, robust, and exciting intellectual discipline to be a part of. As I say, on the Center for Libertarian Studies, we had an annual Libertarian Scholars Conference. Then we published a journal, the Journal of Libertarian Studies, and we really debated with each other what were the fine points of libertarian political theory. And it was just very, very exciting to be a part of that debate. That debate more or less died out. Unlike, in contrast with constitutional conservatism, the conservative legal movement, which had a federal society within which academic debate continued, and the Federal Society is known for the fact that it's organized around debates, as much internal debates as it is outside debates. The theory of constitutional conservatism has grown much more robust over the years, as it had to do because of internal tensions, a debate, and debate with the external world. Libertarianism, on the other hand, with the demise of the Center for Libertarian Studies, has fizzled out as an intellectual project. What's happened is a couple of things. You have think tanks like the Cato Institute, but they're organized around a list of policies. They don't do libertarian theory. This is supposed to be an applied libertarian think tank, not doing first principles theory. You have Reason Magazine. It's a magazine. It doesn't do libertarian theory. And of the people who came through the Institute for Humane Studies network, like me, actually, I didn't. I sort of came through. I did come through the network. I talk about that. It was just before they had many of their other programs. But as people like me who came through that, and we become successful academics, it's always within our own disciplines. So you have somebody, like David Schmidt, who's making a big contribution in the field that he's in as a philosopher, and all these people, but they're not getting together with each other and hashing out the libertarian model. And as a result of that, and I closed the book with this expression of concern on my part, as a result of that, I think libertarian theory, as a political theory, has been frozen in amber since the 1980s. That's 50 years, 40 or 50 years, where it hasn't really developed. And I don't think any theory can just remain static like that in the face of other intellectual developments and situational change. As a result, I think this is something that libertarians need to up their game on. And the book, I have a concluding chapter of this book called What's Next? And it's what's next for originalism, what's next for libertarianism, and what's next for Jewry, the Jewish people, which is another theme that animates the book. But the book I write after I finish the one I'm currently working on, which is about my time as a prosecutor in Chicago, is going to be on updating libertarianism, because I think that given my roots in the origins of the libertarian intellectual movement, it really kind of falls to me to call out the movement and say, we need to think about our first principles and how they need to be refined in light of the experiences that we've had over the last 40 or 50 years.
Well, there's so much of your life we haven't covered, but we've got to have some time for audience questions. I want to remind for folks watching online, you can submit a question on the event webpage, Facebook, YouTube, or X using hashtag CatoSCOTUS. But first, are there any audience questions here in the auditorium? I see one down here on the front row. And please speak clearly into the microphone and identify yourself, your name and your affiliation, and keep your question short and succinct. Thank you.
I'm Mark Lerner. So I just heard at another policy forum that when students are asked whether they think that the American system or the communist system is preferable, 60% pick American and 40% pick communist, and they found that very disturbing. How do we change that ratio? My idea was to have everyone read Ayn Rand, which I think is probably impractical and may not be allowed.
Well, part of it is that they don't know what communism is, and after the fall of the USSR, which was a very stark contrast to what the American system was, that was easier for people to appreciate the difference. They were still apologists for the USSR back then, but they were pretty hardcore radicals. Now, with the sort of disappearance of that form of state communism, at least on a grand scale, you certainly have it in countries around the world, they just don't know what they're talking about. So the only way to combat that is to educate them on what communism is. Many of them think communism, or usually it's socialism, not communism. The survey that you're talking about might have used the word socialism and not used the word communism. Socialism just sounds like be nice to people, or it's, what do they call it? Sharing. It's what we share together and stuff. Well, if that's what they think it is, you can understand why they would be attracted to it. So they just don't know.
More questions in the audience? Anyone? All right, Randy, we have a very direct question for you from online. This is anonymous. Why do you think the Ninth Amendment is so important when many constitutional scholars don't?
Because the Ninth Amendment says, for the benefit of all of you who have not memorized it, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. That was the first part of the Constitution I became expert on when I began to be dragged into constitutional law. And the reason why it's important is because it's an express affirmation of natural rights. Natural rights, about which Jonathan has written in his new book, Free Speech in an Age of Rage, is that the name of it? It's a fantastic book. And what makes his book so remarkable and different than other books written by constitutional law professors is that he defends freedom of speech not merely as an instrumental good, as something that is a means to the end of self-governance or the marketplace of ideas, a means to the end of truth, but actually as part of our nature as human beings, that we need to speak, that our brains are wired to speak. What makes us different as creatures is that we speak. And speech so speech is a part, that's just a piece of a total argument about why speech is a natural right, because it's so bound up in our nature. And what the Ninth Amendment is a textual recognition of the existence of natural rights, because the Ninth Amendment refers to rights retained by the people, and if you do pretty much the slightest bit of research as to what that word retained was meaning or referring to, is it referring to natural rights. It refers to the pre-existing rights that you have as human beings before you enter into civil society and enter into a social compact like the Constitution itself. And that's why the Ninth Amendment is so. There were other proposals to get natural rights into the text of the Constitution that Madison made that did not get adopted, but that's one that did get in, and that's important. And it explains why the right, it is further justification for Jonathan's argument that the right of freedom of speech is a protection of a natural right, not just an instrumentally good right.
Yeah, I should note, by the way, that I think when you look at the scholarship of Randy through the years, his contribution on the Ninth Amendment, I think, will be the one that really captures that legacy more than anything else. And it is elegant in that it really captures what is the essence of what Randy talks about in the book, of how he became who he is. It makes abundant sense. And under sort of viewing it through his life, it brings a new depth to it. I'll also note that some of the contributions that people often don't mention, because the Ninth Amendment is often right up there, is also, he has ideas including the repeal amendment that we haven't mentioned, which I absolutely love. This idea that Randy sees the value of federalism, but obviously we've had changes in our system that has marginalized states as players in governance. And his idea that states should be given the ability to repeal legislation is fascinating, but the reason I'm raising it with the Ninth Amendment is it shows what you can come up with when you truly stand apart. Those are ideas that were so novel and so interesting. It sort of, people sort of went, wow, people across the spectrum, like, that was such a novel idea. And it's because he has spent his life looking not only from within, but also from outside.
And it was actually introduced into both houses of Congress at one point. We just ran out of dark money to promote it. We didn't get enough dark money. We didn't get any dark money. That's what we were looking to get.
Yeah, well, one of many amazing stories in the book. Unfortunately, we have time for maybe one super quick one from my colleague Brent. Got 30 seconds, Brent.
Brent Scora, I'm curious, what do you attribute, you mentioned libertarian theory being frozen in amber, what do you attribute that to? And second, I guess briefly, has, I don't know, the left or progressives, have they updated their theory or status, however you define kind of the anti-libertarian position, have they updated their theory in the past?
I attribute it to a lack of an institutional structure in which these debates happen, which is what the Center for Libertarian Studies provided until it was no more. And it's what the Federal Society does provide with respect to constitutional interpretation. So that's why I attribute it to. The left, they can sort of speak for themselves, but I do think that I have some ideas of the direction this should take, and if you're interested in that, you can check an essay I put up on Law and Liberty called Libertarianism Updated, came out on July 3rd of this year, and I give the 5 features that I think an updated libertarianism needs to take account of.
Thank you so much for that. Let's all show our appreciation for our panelists. All right. Thank you. We've got plenty of books out for sale right in this hallway here. I believe you have time to sign
Happy
some?
to sign them.
That's fantastic. And then we'll, I believe, be serving lunch upstairs. And thank you all for coming.